George Strait is humiliated in a luxury jewelry store, but his attitude touched everyone. The morning sun cast a golden glow over downtown Nashville, illuminating the polished glass storefronts of the city's most exclusive shopping district. Among them stood Carlyle and Sons, a jewelry store whose reputation for luxury was matched only by its reputation for catering to the elite. Inside, diamonds sparkled under carefully positioned lighting, and the soft hum of classical music created an atmosphere of refined opulence. George Strait adjusted his worn cowboy hat as he stepped out of his modest pickup truck. At 68 years old, the king of country had amassed more #1 hits than any artist in history besides the Beatles, yet nothing about his appearance suggested his legendary status. He wore a simple button-up shirt, comfortable blue, jeans that had seen better days, and boots that showed the honest wear of a man who valued function over fashion. His face, weathered by years under the Texas sun, carried the quiet dignity of someone who had never needed to prove himself to anyone. Today marked 49 years since he had married Norma, the love of his life and his anchor through fame, fortune, and heartbreak. Nearly 5 decades of a love that had survived the crushing loss of their daughter, the demands of stardom, and the ordinary challenges that test any marriage. For their upcoming 50th anniversary, he wanted something extraordinary, a symbol worthy of their enduring love. He approached the store with purpose in his step, but humility in his heart. George had never been one for flash or extravagance, despite having the means for both. His ranch in Texas and his modest home in Nashville were comfortable, but not ostentatious. His greatest treasures weren't things that could be displayed in glass cases, but moments. Singing his first hit on the Grand Ole Opry stage, watching his son follow in his musical footsteps, and quiet evenings with Norma on their porch swing. As he pushed open the heavy glass door of Carlyle and Sons, a small bell announced his arrival. The interior was even more impressive than the exterior. Marble floors so polished they reflected the crystal chandeliers hanging overhead, glass cases lined with velvet displaying jewelry worth more than most people's homes. A few other customers browsed the selections, all dressed in clothes that announced their wealth without saying a word. Hey folks, if you're enjoying this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything, and I'd love to hear what you think about George's situation so far. Now, let's get back to what happens next in this incredible, true story. George removed his hat respectfully as he entered, holding it against his chest, a gesture of courtesy from an era when such things still mattered. He stood for a moment looking around, taking in the opulence with appreciation but not awe. He had been in places far grander, had performed for presidents and royalty, but he still carried himself with the same down-to-earth demeanor that had endeared him to millions. Blake Anderson had been working at Carlyle and Sons for just under a year. At 26, he was the youngest sales associate, and he approached his job with the kind of ambitious hunger that often came at the expense of wisdom. Dressed in a tailored suit that cost 3 months' rent, with his dark hair perfectly styled and a Rolex watch purchased on credit gleaming on his wrist, he considered himself a connoisseur of character, able to size up a potential client's worth with a single glance. And Blake's assessment of the older man who had just walked in was immediate and dismissive, not worth his time. From the worn boots to the faded jeans to the weathered hat, everything about the customer screamed tourist or lost. Certainly not someone who could afford even the most modest piece in the store's collection. When their store manager stepped into the back office to take an important call, Blake saw his chance. Normally, Matthew Carlyle, the owner's son, insisted that every customer be treated with respect, regardless of appearance, a policy Blake considered naively egalitarian. With Matthew temporarily absent, Blake could exercise what he considered better judgment. He approached George with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Can I help you find the exit, sir?" His tone was polite on the surface, but laced with condescension. "Or perhaps you're looking for the Western Wear store. It's about 3 blocks down." George turned to face the young man, his expression unchanging, save for a slight tightening around his eyes. When he spoke, his voice carried the same gentle, measured cadence that had delivered countless ballads of love and loss to audiences worldwide. "Actually, son, I'm looking for something special, a gift for my wife." Blake's smile stiffened further. He glanced quickly at the other customers, a couple examining diamond earrings with the store's senior associate, and a well-dressed woman being shown an elaborate necklace by Matthew's wife, Sarah. Both valuable clients who deserved attention from the staff, not this person. "I see," Blake said, not bothering to hide his skepticism. "And what sort of budget did you have in mind?" "We do have some simpler pieces." He gestured vaguely toward a small display case near the door that contained the store's least expensive items, still carrying price tags that would make most people blanch. George followed the gesture with his eyes, then looked back at Blake. There was no anger in his gaze, just a quiet assessment. "I wasn't thinking about a budget particularly. When you've been married nearly 50 years to the perfect woman, price doesn't much matter for a golden anniversary gift." Blake's eyebrows rose slightly, more in disbelief than impression. 50 years of marriage suggested this man was older than he'd initially thought, but it didn't change his assessment of the situation. People like this often came in, dreaming of buying something they couldn't afford, wasting valuable time that could be spent with serious customers. 50 years. That's quaint, Blake said, the word dripping with insincerity. "Perhaps I could show you our sterling silver collection. It's quite adequate." The implication was clear. Gold and platinum were out of this customer's league. A flicker of something, not quite anger but certainly disappointment, passed behind George's eyes. Throughout his career, he had encountered all types: the sycophants who fawned over his fame, the industry executives who saw him as nothing more than a profitable commodity, and everyday folks who treated him like a neighbor. But there was something particularly distasteful about being judged solely on his appearance, about being found wanting before he'd even had a chance to speak properly. "I was thinking more along the lines of diamonds," George said evenly. "Something that catches the light just right. Norma deserves the best." Blake couldn't suppress a small, incredulous laugh. "Diamonds, of course." He gestured for George to follow him to a display case that held several modestly priced diamond pieces, modest by Carlyle and Sons standards, which still meant tens of thousands of dollars. "These are our entry-level diamonds," Blake explained with thinly veiled condescension. "Perhaps something like this might work for your situation." He pointed to a simple diamond pendant on a thin gold chain. At $12,000, it was one of the least expensive diamond pieces in the store. George leaned forward, examining the pendant with genuine interest. "It's a beautiful piece," he acknowledged. "But I was hoping for something a bit more substantial. Do you have anything with a bit more presence?" Blake's patience was wearing thin. This charade had gone on long enough. "Sir," he said, dropping all pretense of customer service, "these diamonds start at $12,000. The more substantial pieces you're referring to run into the hundreds of thousands. I don't mean to be rude, but I think we both know that's not really within your reach." A painful silence fell between them. Across the store, an older couple glanced over, the woman's expression showing discomfort at overhearing Blake's words. Sarah Carlyle, arranging a display nearby, looked up sharply, but was too far away to have heard the exchange clearly. George straightened up slowly. He was not a tall man, but there was a presence about him that seemed to fill more space than his physical frame should allow. Decades of commanding stages and holding audiences in the palm of his hand had given him an innate authority that needed no volume to assert itself. "Son," he said quietly, "in my experience, it's best not to make assumptions about folks based on what they're wearing or driving. Life has a way of surprising you." Blake scoffed. "Sir, I've been doing this long enough to know 2 years," came a voice from behind them. Matthew Carlyle had returned from his phone call and now stood watching the interaction with an expression of growing horror. "You've been doing this for less than 2 years, Blake." Matthew, in his mid-40s with salt and pepper hair and the confident bearing of someone born into the business, quickly moved toward them. Unlike Blake, he recognized George Strait immediately, not just as a country music legend, but as a customer who had purchased several significant pieces from their store over the years, albeit from their San Antonio location. "Mr. Strait," Matthew said, extending his hand, "it's an honor to have you in our Nashville location. I believe you usually shop with my Uncle Robert in Texas." Blake froze, his face draining of color as the implications of Matthew's greeting sank in. George Strait, the George Strait. One of the wealthiest musicians in the country, worth over $300 million. The man he had just suggested couldn't afford their entry-level diamonds. George shook Matthew's hand firmly. "That's right. Robert's been helping me find special pieces for Norma for years now, but I was in Nashville recording, and your anniversary collection caught my eye when I drove past yesterday." Matthew shot Blake a look that promised a serious conversation later. "I'm deeply sorry if there's been any misunderstanding. Blake is relatively new to our team." The apology was professional, but couldn't quite smooth over the tension in the air. "No harm done," George said, though his eyes suggested otherwise. Not anger at being disrespected, but disappointment at the character it revealed. Throughout his life, he had valued authenticity above all else. It was why his music resonated with millions. He sang about real emotions, real struggles, real love. Encountering such shallow judgment felt like a discordant note in the harmony of his day. "Please, allow me to show you our anniversary collection." "Personally," Matthew offered, "we have several pieces that I believe Mrs. Strait would love." As Matthew led George toward the store's premium section, Blake stood rooted to the spot, mortification washing over him in waves. He had just insulted a music legend, a man whose concert tickets he couldn't even afford, whose songs his own mother played on repeat during his childhood. Sarah Carlyle appeared at Blake's side, her voice low but sharp. "Break room, now." It wasn't a suggestion. As Blake retreated to the employee area, his career prospects flashing before his eyes, George was examining a stunning 5-carat diamond necklace that Matthew had removed from the display. The diamonds were arranged in a pattern that resembled a star catching and reflecting light from every angle. "This is from our celestial collection," Matthew explained. "Each diamond is internally flawless, D-color. The setting is platinum. It's one of our finest pieces." George held the necklace, carefully imagining how it would look around Norma's neck. After all these years, she still took his breath away. She had never been one for flashy jewelry, preferring the simple pearl earrings he had given her early in their marriage. But their golden anniversary called for something extraordinary. "It's beautiful craftsmanship," George acknowledged. "What's the price?" $375,000, Matthew replied without hesitation, knowing full well that the figure would not deter the country music legend. George nodded, still examining the piece. "And the matching earrings I see there?" Matthew removed the earrings from the display, smaller versions of the star-shaped arrangement. $150,000 for the pair. In the break room, Blake sat with his head in his hands. Sarah Carlyle stood before him, arms crossed, "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she asked, her voice controlled, but vibrating with anger. "That is George Strait. George Strait. Not only one of the most successful recording artists of all time, but one of our most valued customers from our Texas location." Blake couldn't look up. "I didn't know," he mumbled. "He looked so ordinary." Sarah's laugh was without humor. "That's because he is ordinary, Blake. That's his whole appeal. He's an ordinary man who happened to have extraordinary talent and success, but he never forgot where he came from." She shook her head in disbelief. "Do you even understand the core of what we do here? We're not just selling jewelry. We're selling moments, memories, celebrations of love and accomplishment." Outside in the store, George was nodding as Matthew described the craftsmanship that went into the Celestial collection. But his mind was elsewhere, replaying the interaction with the young sales associate. There had been a time early in his career when George might have reacted differently, with anger perhaps, or by walking out. But age and experience had taught him that sometimes the greatest impact came not from walking away, but from staying and showing a different way to be. "I'll take the necklace and the earrings," he said simply. "And I'd like to look at your bracelet collection as well. Might as well make it a complete set for our anniversary." Matthew beamed. "Of course, Mr. Strait, right this way." As they moved toward another display case, George paused. "That young man, Blake, was it?" Matthew's smile faltered. "Yes, I can assure you he will be dealt with appropriately." George considered this for a moment, then shook his head slowly. "You know, I think I'd like him to complete my purchase." The request hung in the air between them, unexpected and puzzling. "I'm sorry," Matthew said, certain he had misheard. "I'd like Blake to finalize my purchase," George repeated, his voice gentle but firm. "If that's all right with you?" Matthew hesitated, confusion evident on his face. "Mr. Strait, after the way he treated you, are you sure?" George's weathered face creased into a small smile that carried decades of wisdom. "Sometimes folks need a chance to make things right, to learn from their mistakes. I've found that shame is a powerful teacher, but redemption is an even better one." Matthew's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded with newfound respect. There was clearly more to George Strait's request than simple forgiveness. "Of course, Mr. Strait. I'll get him right away." As Matthew disappeared into the back room, George turned his attention back to the jewelry. He ran a calloused finger gently over the diamond necklace, thinking about Norma's reaction when she opened the box. After 49 years, he still lived to see that sparkle in her eyes, a sparkle more valuable than all the diamonds in this store combined. In the break room, Blake looked up as Matthew entered, his expression already resigned to the inevitable firing he assumed was coming. "Blake," Matthew said, his tone surprisingly even, "Mr. Strait has requested that you personally complete his purchase." Blake's head jerked up, disbelief written across his face. "What? Why would he, after I—" He couldn't even finish the sentence. "I don't know," Matthew admitted, "but what I do know is this. You're being given an opportunity that you absolutely don't deserve. I suggest you make the most of it." He stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. "He's waiting." Blake stood on shaky legs, straightening his tie in a nervous gesture. "What's he buying?" he asked quietly. "The Celestial diamond necklace and matching earrings," Matthew replied, "and he's interested in a bracelet as well." Blake nearly stumbled. The necklace alone was more than he would make in 5 years. That's over $500,000. "Yes," Matthew said simply. "It is." Blake took a deep breath and walked back into the showroom, his earlier arrogance replaced by a nauseating mixture of shame and anxiety. George Strait stood examining a display of diamond bracelets, his posture relaxed and unassuming. Looking at him now, Blake couldn't understand how he had missed the quiet confidence, the self-assured dignity that had nothing to do with designer clothes or flashy accessories. "Mr. Strait," Blake began, his voice barely above a whisper, I I don't know what to say. I'm deeply sorry for how I treated you." George turned to face him, and Blake was struck by the kindness in the older man's eyes. There was no malice. No vengeful satisfaction at seeing him squirm. "Son, do you know what I did before my music career took off?" George asked conversationally, as if they were old friends picking up a discussion. Blake swallowed hard. "No, sir. I worked as a cattle rancher. Spent my days mending fences, branding calves, doing honest work with my hands." George looked down at those hands now, still strong, still bearing the subtle marks of his ranching days, despite decades in the music business. "And before that, I was just a kid from a small town in Texas, not so different from most folks." Blake nodded, uncertain where this was going, but hanging on every word. "When I had my first hit record in the early 80s, I walked into a fancy restaurant in Dallas. Dressed a lot like this, actually." George gestured to his simple attire. "The maitre d' took one look at me and suggested I might be more comfortable at the diner down the street." Blake winced, hearing the echo of his own condescension. "I could have gotten angry, could have made a scene, thrown my name around. But my father taught me that how you respond to disrespect says more about your character than the disrespect itself." George picked up a platinum and diamond bracelet from the display, examining it thoughtfully. "So I just smiled, said, 'Thank you kindly for the suggestion,' and walked out. Found myself a good burger at that diner instead." He placed the bracelet back in the display case. "Not quite what I'm looking for," he murmured, moving to another section. Blake followed, feeling increasingly uncomfortable in the wake of George's story. "Did you ever go back to that restaurant, once you became famous?" "I did," George acknowledged with a small smile. "About 10 years later, same maitre d' was working there. He recognized me immediately, nearly fell over himself apologizing. I just told him I was there for dinner, not apologies." George stopped at another display, his eyes lighting up at a particular piece, a diamond bracelet with the same star pattern as the necklace and earrings. "Now this," he said, "this is perfect." Blake stepped forward to remove it from the case, handling it with the care it deserved. "It's from the same celestial collection," he explained, finding some comfort in reverting to professional knowledge. 7 carats total, all internally flawless diamonds. The craftsmanship is exceptional. Each star has been positioned to catch light from different angles. His voice grew steadier as he spoke about the jewelry. This, at least, he knew how to do. "It's beautiful," George agreed. "I'll take this. On 2. Norma deserves the complete set." Blake nodded, carefully placing the bracelet alongside the necklace and earrings that Matthew had already set aside. "Will there be anything else, Mr. Strait?" George considered for a moment. "Actually, there is one more thing. Do you have any diamond rings that would complement these pieces? Not an engagement ring. She's already got one of those that I gave her back in 71. A smile touched his lips at the memory. Something more like a right-hand ring. Something that celebrates 50 years together." Blake, now fully engaged in his professional role, led George to a display of statement rings. "We have several options that would pair beautifully with the celestial collection. This one in particular continues the star motif," he said, pointing to a stunning ring, with a center diamond surrounded by smaller stones in a starburst pattern. George studied it, then nodded. "That's the one. What's the price on that?" $98,000, Blake replied, his earlier hesitation about discussing high prices completely forgotten. The total purchase was now approaching $700,000, the largest single sale he had ever handled or even witnessed. "Perfect," George said simply. "I'll take it." As Blake gathered the selected pieces and began preparing the paperwork for the sale, other customers in the store watched with poorly concealed interest. Word had spread quickly. Whispers of "That's George Strait" floated through the room. accompanied by discreet glances and smartphone photos taken from a distance. Sarah Carlyle approached, her earlier anger at Blake temporarily set aside in favor of providing exceptional service to their VIP customer. "Mr. Strait, would you like some coffee, or perhaps something stronger, while Blake prepares your purchase?" George shook his head with a polite smile. "No, thank you, ma'am. I'm just fine." Sarah nodded and turned to Blake. "Please use the private sales room for Mr. Strait's comfort." Blake led George to an elegantly appointed room at the back of the store, where wealthy clients could make their purchases away from prying eyes. As they entered, Blake gestured to a comfortable leather chair. "Please, make yourself comfortable. Sir, this will just take a few minutes to process." George sat down, removing his hat and placing it on his knee. As Blake began entering the sale details into the computer system, an uncomfortable silence fell between them. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Blake spoke. "Mr. Strait, I have to ask, why did you request me to complete your purchase? After how I treated you, I mean." George considered the question thoughtfully. "Have you ever made a mistake, son? A real one, I mean, the kind that keeps you up at night?" Blake's mind immediately flashed to several professional mistakes, personal ones, moments of shame that he'd tried to bury beneath his carefully constructed image of success. "Yes, sir, I have." "And did anyone ever give you a chance to make it right? To learn from it instead of just suffering the consequences?" Blake thought about this. There had been a few professors who allowed him to retake tests, a girlfriend who forgave a significant betrayal, a mentor in college who saw potential in him despite his arrogance. Those moments of grace had shaped him, though perhaps not as deeply as they should have. "Some people did," he admitted quietly. George nodded. "Those are the moments that change us. Not the punishments, but the unexpected mercies." He leaned forward slightly. "I requested you because I believe that how we treat people who have nothing to offer us reveals our true character. And how we respond when we're caught showing poor character, well, that reveals something even deeper." Blake felt exposed, as if this man he had just met could somehow see every flaw and failing he'd tried so hard to hide beneath designer suits and practiced swagger. "I grew up without much," George continued. "My family worked hard for everything we had. When success came my way, I promised myself I'd never forget what it felt like to be judged by what I didn't have rather than who I was." And the sales system chimed, indicating that the transaction was ready to be completed. Blake turned the screen toward George, showing the total $698,000, not including the tax. Without hesitation, George reached into his back pocket and removed a simple leather wallet. From it, he extracted a black credit card, the kind issued only to those with extraordinary wealth or spending habits. Blake took it with slightly trembling hands, completing the transaction with a sense of unreality. As the receipt printed, George studied the young man before him. "You know, I've met all kinds in this business. The ones who last, who find real success and happiness. They're not the ones who climb over others or judge books by their covers. They're the ones who treat the janitor with the same respect they show the CEO." Blake handed George his card and the receipt to sign. Processing. The wisdom he'd just been offered. It ran counter to everything he'd been telling himself about success. That it came from projecting an image, from associating with the right people, from distinguishing yourself from those of lesser status. "I've been rethinking some things," Blake admitted as George signed the receipt. "Even before today, the way I've been approaching my career, my life." He trailed off, unsure how to articulate the growing emptiness he'd been feeling, despite his outward trappings of success. George handed back the signed receipt. "That's a good start. Rethinking is usually the first step to changing." As they stood to leave the private room, George put his hat back on with the easy grace of a man who had worn one most of his life. "I appreciate your help today, Blake. I think Norma's going to love these pieces." Blake felt a complex mixture of emotions, lingering shame, yes, but also an unexpected sense of having been part of something significant. Not just a major sale, but a moment of genuine human connection and learning. As they walked back into the main showroom, Matthew approached with a discreet black shopping bag bearing the Carlisle & Sons logo in silver lettering. Inside were 4 elegant jewelry boxes containing George's purchases, each wrapped in the store's signature silver paper. "Everything has been prepared according to your preferences, Mr. Strait," Matthew said, handing the bag to George. "The insurance documentation will be emailed to you, and we've included our care instructions for each piece." George accepted the bag with a nod of thanks. "I appreciate it. Your San Antonio store has always taken good care of me, and I'm glad to see the same quality here in Nashville." Matthew smiled, relief evident in his expression. "We're honored by your business. Please don't hesitate to contact us if there's anything else we can do for you." As George prepared to leave, he turned back to Blake, who stood watching him with an expression of conflicted admiration. "Just out of curiosity," George said, "what made you approach me the way you did when I first came in?" The directness of the question caught Blake off guard. He opened his mouth to offer an excuse, then closed it again. If there was ever a moment for honesty, this was it. "I judged you based on your clothes," he admitted, the words painful but necessary. "I saw the jeans and the hat and decided you couldn't possibly afford anything here." He swallowed hard. "I thought I was being efficient, focusing on customers who would make me money." George nodded, no judgment in his expression. "And how did that work out?" A surprised laugh escaped Blake, short and somewhat bitter. "Well, you just made the biggest purchase I've ever handled, so—" "Not great." George smiled, a genuine warmth reaching his eyes. "Life's funny that way, isn't it? Full of surprises." He extended his hand. "It was nice meeting you, Blake. I hope our paths cross again someday." Blake shook the offered hand, feeling both humbled and strangely hopeful. "Thank you, Mr. Strait, for everything." As George walked toward the door, a small crowd of customers and even a few passers-by had gathered, word of his presence having spread through the shopping district. He nodded politely to them, but didn't stop, his thoughts already turning to Norma and the celebration they would soon share. Back in the store, Blake stood watching the country legend's departure, a profound sense of having been changed settling over him. Matthew approached, standing beside him in silence for a moment. "I should fire you," Matthew said finally, his voice low. "What you did goes against everything we stand for at Carlisle & Sons." Blake nodded, accepting this as his due. "I know." Matthew turned to face him. "But I think Mr. Strait just gave you a lesson worth more than any training I could provide. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to spend the next month working with every client who walks through that door, regardless of how they're dressed or what car they drive. Everyone gets the same level of service, your best. At the end of that month, we'll reevaluate." Blake met his boss's gaze, unexpected gratitude washing over him. "Thank you. I won't let you down." "Don't thank me," Matthew said. "Thank the man in the cowboy hat who just showed you what real class looks like." George drove his pickup truck through the bustling streets of Nashville, the black Carlisle & Sons bag resting on the passenger seat beside him. The afternoon sun filtered through the windshield, casting a warm glow over the interior of his modest vehicle. Despite owning a collection of luxury cars, George preferred this truck for everyday driving. It kept him grounded, reminded him of simpler times. As he navigated through traffic, his mind wandered back to the young man at the jewelry store. There had been something familiar in Blake's arrogance, a reminder of how easy it was to get lost in the trappings of success and forget what truly mattered. George had seen it countless times throughout his career. Young artists who achieved a taste of fame only to lose themselves in its intoxicating embrace. He thought about his own journey, how different it might have been if he had allowed success to change him the way it changed so many others. When Unwound, his first hit single, climbed the charts in 1981, he had been no different from any other aspiring musician, hungry for recognition, eager to prove himself. The difference was in how he'd responded to that success when it came. Norma had been his anchor through it all. Their love story had begun when they were just teenagers in Pearsall, Texas, high school sweethearts who married young and weathered every storm together. She had been there before the fame, during its dizzying heights, and remained by his side as they entered this later, more reflective chapter of their lives. George pulled into the driveway of their Nashville home, comfortable and elegant, but far from the mansions owned by many of his peers. He preferred their ranch in Texas, but they maintained this residence for his recording sessions and business in Music City. As he switched off the engine, he glanced at the jewelry bag once more, anticipating Norma's reaction to his anniversary gift. Inside the house, the familiar scent of Norma's cooking greeted him. Even after all these years, she insisted on making most of their meals herself, despite having the means to hire any chef they desired. Her chicken and dumplings remained his favorite dish, a taste of home that no high-end restaurant could replicate. "That you, George?" her voice called from the kitchen, still carrying traces of her Texas upbringing. "It's me, darlin'," he replied, carefully hiding the shopping bag behind his back as he made his way through the living room. Framed photographs lined the walls, a visual timeline of their life together, their wedding day in 1971, holding their son, Bubba, for the first time, standing beside their daughter, Jennifer, in what would be one of the last photos taken before the car accident that claimed her life at age 13. The grief of that loss had nearly broken them, but somehow their love had emerged stronger, tempered by shared sorrow. Norma appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. At 67, she remained as beautiful to George as the day they'd met. Her hair had silvered gracefully, and laugh lines framed her eyes, evidence of a life filled with more joy than sorrow despite the heartaches they'd endured. She smiled at his obvious attempt to hide something behind his back. "What are you up to, George Strait?" He grinned, feeling suddenly like the shy teenager who had first asked her to dance all those decades ago. "Just picked up a little something while I was out." Her eyes narrowed playfully. "Our anniversary isn't for another 2 weeks." "I know," he said, keeping the bag hidden, "but when you see something perfect, you don't wait." Meanwhile, back at Carlyle & Sons, Blake was experiencing what could only be described as an existential crisis. The encounter with George Strait had shaken the carefully constructed foundation of his worldview. As he assisted another customer, an elderly woman looking for a gift for her granddaughter's graduation, he found himself paying attention in a way he never had before. Mrs. Henderson wore clothes from a department store, not a boutique, and carried a purse that had seen better days. 2 weeks ago, Blake might have given her perfunctory assistance at best. Today, he listened intently as she described her granddaughter's accomplishments, the first in their family to graduate from college, heading to medical school in the fall. "She's worked so hard," Mrs. Henderson said, her eyes shining with pride. "I want to give her something special, something that shows her how proud I am, but I'm on a fixed income." "I understand," Blake said, and for perhaps the first time in his career, he genuinely did. "Let me show you some options that might work for your budget." He guided her to a display of silver and semi-precious stones, beautiful pieces that wouldn't strain her finances. When she eventually selected a delicate silver necklace with a small sapphire pendant, the joy on her face was as genuine as any he'd seen from clients spending 50 times as much. As he carefully wrapped the necklace, Mrs. Henderson studied him with a grandmotherly perceptiveness. "You're different from the last time I was in here," she observed. Blake looked up, surprised. "You've been in before?" She nodded. "About 6 months ago. I was looking for an anniversary gift for my husband. You barely spoke 2 words to me before passing me off to another associate." Shame colored Blake's cheeks. "I'm sorry about that, Mrs. Henderson. I've been re-evaluating some things recently." She smiled, the wisdom of her years evident in her expression. "That's how we grow, young man, by re-evaluating and then changing." After Mrs. Henderson left, Blake found himself thinking about her granddaughter, a young woman he had never met, but who had overcome obstacles he couldn't imagine to achieve her dreams. How many other stories had he missed in his rush to judge, to categorize, to dismiss? Sarah Carlyle approached him as he straightened a display. "That was good work with Mrs. Henderson," she said. Her earlier anger softened, but not entirely gone. "Thanks," Blake replied, genuinely appreciating the acknowledgement. "She's a wonderful lady." Sarah studied him for a moment. "You know, my father-in-law, old Mr. Carlyle, who started this business, he used to say that jewelry is just metal and stones until it becomes part of someone's story. Our real job isn't selling diamonds, it's helping people mark the important chapters in their lives." Blake nodded slowly, the wisdom of that statement resonating with him. "I think I'm starting to understand that." Across town, George had convinced Norma to join him on the back porch, her favorite spot for morning coffee and evening reflection. The wooden swing that hung there had been a gift for their 40th anniversary, handcrafted by a local artisan who had incorporated subtle musical notes into the design. "Should I be worried about what's in that bag?" Norma teased as they settled onto the swing, the gentle creak of its chains providing a rhythmic backdrop to the moment. George chuckled, not worried, maybe excited. He handed her the bag, watching, as curiosity overtook her features. She had never been one for extravagant jewelry. The simple band on her left hand and a pair of pearl earrings he'd given her years ago were her usual adornments. But their 50th anniversary deserved something extraordinary. Norma reached into the bag and removed the first box, the smallest one containing the ring. Her hands, which had once helped him mend fences on their first small property and later rocked their children to sleep, trembled slightly as she opened it. "Oh, George," she breathed, eyes widening at the sight of the diamond ring glittering against the black velvet interior. It's beautiful." "There's more," he said softly. One by one she opened the remaining boxes, each revelation drawing a deeper gasp of surprise. The earrings, the bracelet, finally the necklace, the centerpiece of the collection, its diamond stars capturing and reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. "George Strait," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "What on earth were you thinking, spending this kind of money?" He took her hand, his thumb brushing over the knuckles that had grown slightly more pronounced with age. "I was thinking about 50 years, Norma. 50 years of you loving me, supporting me, being my home no matter where we are." He paused, emotion threatening to overcome his usually steady voice. 50 years of you choosing me every day, even when it wasn't easy." Tears welled in her eyes. "I've never needed diamonds to be happy with you. You know that." "I know," he agreed. "That's exactly why you deserve them." She leaned against his shoulder, the way she had thousands of times before, fitting perfectly, as she always had. "You're a fool with your money, cowboy," she murmured, but the affection in her voice belied any real criticism. "Only when it comes to you," he replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. As they sat together, watching, The sunset paint, the Nashville sky in shades of pink and gold. George told her about his experience at the jewelry store. Norma listened intently, her expression shifting from indignation at how he'd been treated to thoughtful consideration of how he'd responded. "You've always been that way," she said when he finished, "seeing the best in people, giving them a chance to be better than their mistakes." She touched his face gently. "It's one of the reasons I've loved you all these years." George covered her hand with his own. "That young man reminded me a little of myself at his age. Not the judgment part," he clarified quickly, "but the hunger, the feeling that you need to prove yourself, to be seen as successful." He paused, reflecting. "It took me years to understand that true success has very little to do with what others see." At Carlyle and Sons, the workday was coming to an end. As the last customers departed and the staff began closing procedures, Matthew called Blake into his office. The room was understated but elegant, with framed photographs of notable clients and treasured pieces from the store's history adorning the walls. "Sit down, Blake," Matthew said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Blake complied, his professional demeanor unable to fully mask his nervousness. Despite George Strait's forgiveness and Matthew's earlier reprieve, he couldn't shake the feeling that more consequences were coming, and perhaps deservedly so. Matthew studied him for a long moment. "I've been thinking about what happened today." "So have I," Blake admitted. "I can't stop thinking about it, actually." "Good." Matthew nodded. "That means there's hope for you yet." He leaned forward slightly. "Do you know why I didn't fire you on the spot?" Blake shook his head. "Because 15 years ago, I was you." Matthew's confession hung in the air between them. "Not here, at our Chicago location. I was fresh out of business school, thought. I knew everything. A woman came in wearing gardening clothes, dirt still under her nails. I treated her, well, much like you treated Mr. Strait today." Blake winced at the comparison but remained silent. "Turns out, she was the widow of one of Chicago's wealthiest real estate developers, stopping in after working in her beloved garden. She was there to buy a $2 million necklace for her daughter's wedding." Matthew's expression grew distant with the memory. "My father, who owned all the stores back then, happened to be visiting that day. He witnessed the whole thing." "What happened?" Blake asked quietly. "He took me into this very office. It was his then, and gave me a choice. Learn from the mistake and become a better person, or clean out my desk." Matthew met Blake's gaze directly. "I'm giving you the same choice he gave me." Blake nodded slowly, a weight lifting from his shoulders even as a new responsibility settled there. "I want to learn. I want to be better. Then here's what we're going to do," Matthew said, his tone shifting to one of practical mentorship. "As I said on the floor, for the next month, you treat every customer who walks through that door like they're George Strait in disguise. After that month, we'll evaluate where you are." "I understand," Blake said, determination replacing his earlier shame. "And one more thing," Matthew added. "I want you to help Sarah with our community outreach program. We provide jewelry for local charity auctions, sponsor scholarships for students from low-income backgrounds interested in design and craftsmanship. It might give you some perspective." Blake nodded again, finding himself genuinely interested. In this aspect of the business he'd previously ignored. "I'd like that." As Blake left the office, the events of the day replaying in his mind, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, a sense of purpose beyond commission checks and status symbols. He thought of George Strait, of how the country legend had turned what could have been a moment of justified anger into an opportunity for growth and learning. The night was falling as Blake walked to his car, a leased luxury vehicle that cost more per month than he could really afford, part of the image he'd been so desperate to project. Sitting in the driver's seat, he didn't immediately start the engine. Instead, he pulled out his phone and called a number he hadn't dialed in too long. "Mom," he said when she answered. "Yeah, it's me. I know it's been a while. I was wondering if that dinner invitation for Sunday is still open." The warmth in her response made him realize how much he'd been missing while pursuing what he thought was success. 3 weeks later, the Nashville Convention Center buzzed with activity as preparations for the Country Music Benefit Gala reached their final stages. The annual event brought together legends and rising stars alike to raise funds for music education in rural communities, a cause George Strait had championed throughout his career. Backstage, George adjusted his black tie in the mirror, looking every inch the king of country in his tailored tuxedo. The distinction between this polished figure and the man in worn jeans who had walked into Carlisle & Sons would have shocked Blake Anderson. But to George, the tuxedo was just another costume. The jeans and work shirts were who he really was. Norma entered the dressing room, and George's reflection caught his breath. She wore an elegant black gown that complemented her silver hair perfectly, but what truly drew the eye was the celestial diamond necklace glittering at her throat. The matching earrings and bracelet completed the ensemble, transforming his already beautiful wife into something ethereal. "I feel a little ridiculous wearing all this," she admitted, touching the necklace self-consciously. "Like I'm playing. Dress up." George turned to face her, taking her hands in his. "You look perfect," he said, the simple words carrying the weight of a lifetime of admiration. "Absolutely perfect." She smiled, the expression lighting her face in a way that no diamond ever could. "The girls at the benefit committee nearly fainted when they saw these," she said, gesturing to the jewelry. "Melissa Thompson asked if they were real." George chuckled. "What did you tell her?" "I told her my husband might look like he buys his clothes at the farm supply store, but he cleans up pretty nice when he wants to." Her eyes twinkled with mischief. I think she was more shocked by that than by the diamonds. A knock at the door interrupted their moment. 10 minutes, Mr. Strait," called the event coordinator. "Thank you," George replied, his focus still on Norma. "Ready to face the cameras, Mrs. Strait." She straightened his tie slightly, a gesture she had performed countless times over their decades together. "With you?" "Always." Across town at Carlisle & Sons, Blake was in the midst of the busiest sales day of his career. A celebrity stylist had come in looking for pieces for 3 different clients attending the very same benefit gala, and Blake had been assigned as her personal associate for the day. In the past month, his transformation had not gone unnoticed. Regular customers commented on the change in his demeanor, the genuine interest he now took in their stories, the patience he showed even with the most indecisive clients. Matthew had observed the change with quiet approval, while Sarah had begun inviting him to participate more actively in the store's community initiatives. "What about these for Ms. Reynolds?" the stylist asked, pointing to a pair of sapphire and diamond earrings. Blake removed them from the display, considering them thoughtfully. "They're beautiful, but given the neckline of the gown you described, I wonder if something a bit more dramatic might work better," he suggested, moving to another display case. "Perhaps something like these?" He presented an alternative pair, cascading diamonds that would catch the light with every movement. The stylist's eyes lit up. "Those are perfect. You have a good eye, Blake." "I'm learning," he replied modestly. "It's about understanding the whole story, not just selling a piece of jewelry." As the stylist continued selecting items, Blake's phone vibrated with a text message. Discreetly checking it, he saw it was from his mother. "Proud of you for the changes you're making, honey. Dad and I are looking forward to dinner tomorrow." The simple message warmed him in a way that no commission, even from today's substantial sales, could match. The Sunday dinner he'd attended 3 weeks ago had been the first of what was becoming a regular tradition again. Sitting at his parents' modest dining table, eating his mother's pot roast, he had felt a contentment that had been missing from his life of luxury restaurants and status-seeking. The changes weren't just in his professional life. Blake had moved out of his too-expensive apartment into a smaller place, traded in the least luxury car for something more reasonable, and started paying down the credit card debt he'd accumulated trying to maintain his image. The freedom from financial stress had been immediate and profound. At the gala, George and Norma made their entrance to appreciative murmurs from the crowd. Though George Strait was no stranger to these events, he rarely walked the red carpet, preferring to slip in quietly through side entrances. Tonight, however, was special. Not just because he was receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award, but because Norma had agreed to accompany him despite her usual reluctance toward the spotlight. Photographers called their names, flashbulbs illuminating. The diamonds at Norma's throat and wrist. She squeezed George's hand tightly, drawing strength from his steady presence as she had for 50 years. "Mr. Strait, Mrs. Strait, over here!" the photographers called. George guided Norma through the gauntlet with practiced ease, pausing briefly for photos, but never lingering too long. He had always understood that fame was part of the job, not the purpose of it. Inside, they were led to their table near the stage where several other country music legends and their spouses were already seated. The conversation flowed easily among old friends who had traveled similar roads, witnessed the same changes in the industry, and shared the unique experience of balancing public personas with private lives. "Norma, those diamonds are spectacular," remarked Barbara Brooks, Garth's wife. "Special occasion." Norma smiled, touching the necklace gently. "Our 50th is coming up next week." Barbara's eyes widened. 50 years. That's remarkable in any circumstance, but especially in this business. George placed his hand over Norma's on the table. "Best decision I ever made was asking this girl to marry me. Everything else, every record, every award, that's all just bonus." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. In an industry where marriages often fell victim to the pressures of fame, their enduring relationship was perhaps his greatest achievement. Back at Carlyle & Sons, the day was winding down. The celebrity stylist had left with her selections, and Blake was completing the substantial paperwork involved in such a large sale. Sarah approached as he worked, a smile playing at her lips. "So," she said, perching on the edge of the desk, "I heard your clients are headed to the same gala as Mr. Strait tonight." Blake nodded, looking up from his paperwork. "Small world. Matthew and I were just discussing the Community Outreach Committee," Sarah continued. "We'd like you to take a more formal role. Your work with the scholarship program has been impressive." Blake set down his pen, genuinely surprised by the offer. "I'd be honored," he said. The interview sessions with the student applicants last week, hearing their stories, their ambitions, despite limited resources, it was eye-opening. Sarah nodded approvingly. "That's exactly why we think you're right for this. You've developed something essential in this business that can't be taught: genuine empathy." Blake thought about how fundamentally his perspective had shifted in just 1 month. "I had a good teacher," he said quietly. "Yes," Sarah agreed. "George Strait gave you a masterclass in integrity in about 20 minutes. Some people spend lifetimes and never learn what he showed you that day." As the main program of the gala began, the Master of Ceremonies, a popular country radio host, took the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 30th Annual Country Music Education Benefit." Enthusiastic applause filled the ballroom. "Tonight, we're here to support music programs in schools across rural America, ensuring that the next generation of country artists have the tools they need to find their voice." George listened attentively, his hand still covering Norma's. Throughout his career, he had never forgotten his own humble beginnings or the difference that early access to music education had made in his life. His first guitar, a gift from His father, when he was in middle school, had set him on a path that would eventually lead to 60 number-one hits and millions of albums sold. But tonight, sitting beside the woman who had been there from the very beginning, he was simply grateful. The evening progressed through dinner, testimonials from students who had benefited from the program, and performances by both established artists and promising newcomers. Finally, it was time for the Lifetime Achievement presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, the MC announced, it is my profound honor to present this year's Lifetime Achievement Award to a man whose contributions to country music are immeasurable. With a career spanning over 4 decades, 60 number-one hits, and an unwavering commitment to the authenticity that is the heart and soul of country music, please welcome to the stage the King of Country himself, George Strait. The audience rose in a standing ovation as George kissed Norma's cheek and made his way to the stage. The applause continued for nearly a full minute, a genuine expression of respect from peers and admirers alike. When the room finally quieted, George adjusted the microphone with the ease of a man who had spent most of his life in front of one. "Thank you kindly," he said, his voice carrying the same gentle authority it had when addressing Blake in the jewelry store. "I'm deeply honored, though I have to say, the term lifetime achievement makes me a little nervous. I'm not done yet." Gentle laughter rippled through the crowd. "I've been blessed beyond measure in this life," he continued, "blessed with the gift of music, blessed with the opportunity to share that gift with all of you, and most importantly," he looked directly at Norma, the diamonds at her throat capturing the stage lights, "blessed with a partner who has been my strength through every high and low." Norma's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he continued, "You know, when you've been doing this as long as I have, you learn that the most valuable things in life aren't things at all. They're moments, connections, the way a song can touch someone's heart or change their day, the privilege of being part of people's lives through your music." He paused, his expression thoughtful. "And sometimes life gives you a chance to be a different kind of influence, to remind someone of who they might become if they look beyond the surface." Miles away, Blake was closing up the store, Sarah and Matthew having left earlier for their own evening plans. As he secured the final display case, he paused at the Celestial Collection, now featuring new pieces to replace those purchased by George Strait. Running his finger along the edge of the glass, he reflected on how profoundly his life had changed since that encounter. He had always defined success in terms of external validation, the admiration of others, the trappings of wealth, the exclusivity of his social circle. Now he was beginning to understand success as George Strait embodied it, living with integrity, treating others with dignity regardless of their status, finding joy in meaningful connections rather than superficial achievements. At the gala, George was concluding his acceptance speech. "This award means a great deal to me. But what means more is knowing that tonight we're making sure kids everywhere have the chance to fall in love with music the way I did." He held up the award, a beautifully crafted guitar made of crystal. "Thank you for this honor, and thank you for supporting a cause so dear to my heart." As he returned to his seat amid renewed applause, Norma stood to embrace him. In that moment, with cameras flashing and the crowd watching, they were simply a husband and wife, celebrating a milestone together. The diamonds she wore no more valuable than the simple gold band he had placed on her finger 50 years before. Back in his car after locking up the store, Blake made a decision. Instead of heading to the exclusive club where he once spent his Friday evenings networking with Nashville's elite, he drove to a modest music venue on the outskirts of town. His cousin's band was playing their first real gig tonight, and a month ago, Blake would have made an excuse to avoid attending. Now he couldn't think of anywhere he'd rather be. As he found parking near the small club, he noticed a poster for an upcoming George Strait concert. Pausing to look at it, he felt a surge of gratitude for the unexpected lesson that had changed the course of his life. Someday, he hoped, he might have the opportunity to thank the king of country in person, not for the massive commission from that sale, but for the far more valuable gift of perspective. 6 months later, the Texas sun beat down on the Strait family ranch outside San Antonio. The sprawling property, with its rolling hills and mature oak trees, had been George and Norma's primary residence for decades, the place where they felt most at home, most themselves. Today, the ranch was hosting a special celebration. Tables, draped in white linens, dotted the lawn, each adorned with simple centerpieces of wildflowers in mason jars. String lights hung from the trees, waiting for evening to transform the setting into something magical. A wooden dance floor had been constructed near the barn, beside a small stage where George's band was setting up their equipment. Inside the main house, Norma sat at her dressing table, applying the finishing touches to her makeup. She wore a simple but elegant white dress, not unlike the one she had worn 50 years earlier, when she and George had exchanged vows as teenagers, with nothing but dreams in each other. George appeared in the doorway of their bedroom, handsome in a crisp white shirt, black jacket, and his best jeans. His eyes met Norma's in the mirror, and the look that passed between them held half a century of shared joy, shared grief, shared life. "Ready for our second honeymoon, Mrs. Strait?" he asked, his voice gentle. Norma smiled, touching the celestial diamond necklace that now rested against her skin. She had initially insisted it was too extravagant for regular wear, but George had persuaded her that joy came from using beautiful things, not storing them away. Today, she wore the complete set, the necklace, earrings, bracelet, and ring, their brilliance a fitting symbol for the enduring sparkle of their marriage. 50 years with you, George Strait," she said, rising to meet him. "And I'd sign up for 50 more in a heartbeat." He took her hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture that had never lost its tenderness despite countless repetitions. "Best deal I ever made." Outside, guests were beginning to arrive. Unlike the glitzy Nashville gala, this celebration was intimate, family, close friends, and the people who had been part of their journey from the beginning. Bubba, their son, was helping direct parking with his teenage daughter by his side. Longtime band members, friends from George's early rodeo days, neighbors who had known them before fame came calling, these were the people who mattered most. Among the expected guests was one unlikely addition, Blake Anderson. His invitation had arrived unexpectedly 6 weeks earlier. A simple card with the Strait family crest, requesting his presence at the golden anniversary celebration at the ranch. Included was a handwritten note from George. "Sometimes life gives you a chance to see how stories end. Norma and I would be honored if you'd join us." Geez. Blake had read the invitation multiple times, scarcely believing what he held in his hands. In the months since their encounter at Carlisle & Sons, he had often thought of George Strait, wondering how the story of the diamond purchase had concluded, hoping the anniversary celebration had been everything the couple deserved. The Blake, who now drove his sensible sedan down the dusty road toward the Strait ranch, was barely recognizable as the arrogant young man who had once sneered at a country legend in worn jeans. His transformation had continued, gathering momentum with each passing day. He had been promoted at Carlisle & Sons, taking charge of their community outreach programs while maintaining his sales position. His relationship with his parents had been fully restored. Weekly family dinners, now a cherished tradition rather than an obligation to be avoided. More significantly, he had begun to find genuine fulfillment in connecting with others, in understanding their stories, their motivations, their dreams. The desperate need for status that had once driven him had been replaced by something quieter, but infinitely more satisfying: self-respect. as Blake parked among the trucks and cars. Already lining the ranch's entrance drive, he felt a flutter of nervous anticipation. The invitation had been gracious beyond anything he deserved, a final act of kindness from a man who had already given him the priceless gift of perspective. He stepped out of his car, adjusting his tie, a concession to the occasion, though. He'd opted for a more casual suit, appropriate for a Texas ranch. In his hands, he held a simple gift, a custom-made leather-bound album in which he had collected articles, photographs, and memorabilia documenting George and Norma's 50-year journey together. It had taken weeks of research, countless phone calls to archivists and fan clubs, and the assistance of Strait, who had been surprisingly supportive once Blake explained the backstory of their meeting. Following the sound of conversation and laughter, Blake made his way toward the celebration. The scene that greeted him was both simpler and more beautiful than he had imagined. No extravagant decorations or ostentatious displays of wealth, just the honest warmth of a gathering of loved ones in a place that held meaning. "You must be Blake," came a friendly voice. He turned to find a woman in her early 30s extending her hand. "I'm Jennifer, George and Norma's granddaughter. Grandpa mentioned you might be coming. Said you two met at a jewelry store?" Blake shook her hand, wondering how much of the story George had shared. "That's right. It's nice to meet you, Jennifer." "Come on," she said, gesturing for him to follow. "They're greeting guests over by the big oak tree." As they walked, Blake took in the details of the Strait family home. The ranch house was impressive but unpretentious, exactly what one would expect from a man who had remained true to his roots despite extraordinary success. Through the open barn doors, he could see photographs spanning decades hanging on. The walls telling the story of a family that had weathered fame without being consumed by it. Near a massive oak tree strung with lights, George and Norma stood greeting their guests. Norma's diamonds caught the late afternoon sun, creating tiny rainbows that danced around her as she moved. Yet even more striking was the evident affection between the couple, the way George's hand rested lightly at the small of her back, the synchronicity of their movements after 50 years of sharing the same space. When George spotted Blake approaching, a slow smile spread across his face. "Well, look who made it," he said, extending his hand. "Good to see you again, son." Blake shook his hand firmly. "Thank you for inviting me, Mr. Strait. It means more than I can say." "George," the older man corrected gently, "we're at my home now." He turned slightly. "Norma, this is the young man I told you about, Blake Anderson." Norma's eyes held a knowing warmth as she offered her hand. "Blake, I've heard quite a story about you." Blake felt heat rise to his cheeks. "All true, I'm afraid, Mrs. Strait. Not my finest moment." "Call me Norma," she said, her grip surprisingly strong for her slender build. "And from what George tells me, it might not have been your finest moment, but it led to some fine changes." Before Blake could respond, George gestured to the gathering crowd. "We're about to get started with the ceremony, a little renewal of vows for year 50. Find yourself a good spot, and we'll catch up afterward." As Blake moved toward the seating area, finding an empty chair in one of the back rows, he was struck by the genuine joy that permeated the gathering. There were faces he recognized, country music stars, a few actors, some prominent Texas business people, but none of the pretension or networking that characterized most industry events he had attended in Nashville. A small string quartet began to play, signaling the start of the ceremony. George took his place beneath an arch of wildflowers, his son Bubba standing beside him as best man, just as he had at their 25th anniversary renewal. A pathway cleared among the guests, and Norma appeared, escorted by her grandson. As she walked toward George, Blake noticed something he had missed in his initial observation. Beneath the obvious value of her diamond jewelry was something far more precious. The way her eyes never left George's. The slight tremble of emotion in her hands as she carried a small bouquet of Texas bluebonnets, the soft smile that spoke of a lifetime of memories shared. The ceremony itself was brief, but deeply moving. George and Norma had written their own vows, not flowery declarations, but simple, honest promises reaffirmed after 50 years of keeping them. There wasn't a dry eye among the guests when George took Norma's hands in his and spoke about the journey they had shared. The triumphs and tragedies, the ordinary days and extraordinary moments that had formed the tapestry of their lives together. 50 years ago, I promised to love you through better or worse, George said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. We've seen both, Norma. We've buried a child together. We've celebrated countless joys. Through it all, you've been my center, the place I always return to, the voice that keeps me grounded when the world gets too loud. He squeezed her hands gently. I stand here today, 50 years later, more in love with you than the day we said our first vows. And I promise you 50 more years of that same love, steady, faithful, and true. Norma's response was equally heartfelt, her words painting a picture of a partnership that had weathered fame without succumbing to its pitfalls, that had remained rooted in the values they had brought from their small-town beginnings. As the minister pronounced them husband and wife, still and again, George pulled Norma into a kiss that spoke volumes about the enduring passion between them. The guests erupted in cheers and applause, celebrating not just the milestone, but the example the Straits had set in an industry often marked by broken relationships and discarded vows. The reception that followed was joyful and unpretentious. Barbecue served on paper plates, cold beer in buckets of ice, and homemade pies instead of an elaborate wedding cake. As darkness fell, the string lights illuminated the celebration, creating a warm glow that matched the atmosphere of genuine connection. Blake found himself welcomed into conversations, included in toasts, treated not as an outsider but as an invited guest with a place in the celebration. He watched as George and Norma took to the dance floor for their first dance, George singing softly to her as they moved together with the ease of partners who knew each other's rhythms by heart. Later in the evening, as the party continued, around them, Blake finally had the opportunity to present his gift to the couple. They sat together at a table slightly removed from the main celebration, Norma's head resting comfortably against George's shoulder. I wanted to give you something meaningful, Blake explained, placing the leather album before them. It's a collection of moments from your 50 years together. Articles, photographs, memories from friends and family. George opened the album, he and Norma leaning close together as they turned the pages. Their expressions softened at certain photographs, laughter bubbled up at others, and occasionally one would point out a detail to the other with the intimate shorthand of a couple whose shared history needed no elaborate explanation. This is remarkable, Blake, Norma said, closing the album carefully. Thank you for such a thoughtful gift. George studied Blake for a moment, taking in the changes that were evident not just in his appearance but in his demeanor. The genuine warmth that had replaced calculated charm, the quiet confidence that had supplanted desperate status-seeking. You've done well these past months, George observed. It shows. Blake nodded, accepting the compliment with a humility that would have been foreign to his former self. I've been trying to remember what you taught me that day, that the measure of a person isn't what they wear or drive or how much they spend. George smiled. Seems like the lesson took. It changed everything, Blake admitted. How I approach my work, my relationships, my priorities. I can't thank you enough for that day, not just for not having me fired, which you would have been justified in doing, but for showing me a different way to be. Norma reached across the table, patting Blake's hand. Sometimes the best teachings come from the most unexpected moments. As the evening drew to a close, Blake stood with the other guests to watch George perform a special song he had written for Norma for their anniversary. His rich voice, undiminished by time, filled the Texas night with a melody that somehow captured 50 years of devotion in a few perfect verses. Watching them together, the legend and the woman who had kept him grounded through fame, fortune, and the passage of time, Blake felt a profound sense of privilege at having witnessed not just their celebration, but the depth of character that had made their journey possible. When it was time to leave, Blake joined the line of departing guests to say his goodbyes. When he reached George and Norma, he found himself unexpectedly emotional. "Thank you again for including me today," he said, shaking George's hand firmly. "Seeing you both together, celebrating 50 years, it's inspirational." George's weathered face creased into a warm smile. "Life's about the connections we make, son. The people we love, the moments we share, the ways we grow together." He glanced at Norma, the diamonds at her throat catching the light, but nowhere near as brilliant as the love in her eyes. All the success in the world doesn't mean a thing without that. As Blake drove away from the Strait ranch, the Texas stars brilliant overhead, he carried with him not just the memory of an extraordinary celebration, but the living example of what true success looked like. Not the accumulation of wealth or status, but the building of a life rich in love, integrity, and genuine connection. The encounter that had begun 6 months earlier with his arrogant dismissal of a man in worn jeans had come full circle, transformed into a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. And somewhere on that Texas ranch, the king of country and his queen of 50 years danced beneath the stars, their story still unfolding, their legacy secure not just in music history, but in the lives they had touched along the way, including that of a once judgmental young man who had learned to see beyond appearances to the heart of what truly matters.